Hey everyone, I hope y'all had a wonderful weekend. This week I'm going to be reading The Wizard of Oz. It's pretty long, so I'm just going to read a little bit of it every day. Dorothy lived in the midst of the great Kansas prairies with Uncle Henry, who was a farmer, and Aunt Em, who was the farmer's wife. Their house was small. There were four walls, a floor, and a roof, which made one room, and this room contained a rusty looking cooking stove, a cupboard for the dishes, a table, three or four chairs, and the beds. Uncle Henry and Aunt Em had a big bed in one corner, and Dorothy had a little bed in another corner. There was no garret at all, and no cellar, except a small dark hole dug in the ground called a cyclone cellar, where the family could go in case one of those great whirlwinds arose, mighty enough to crush any building in its path. It was reached by a trap door in the middle of the floor. When Dorothy stood in the doorway and looked around, she could see nothing but the great gray prairie on every side. Not a tree nor a house broke the broad sweep of flat country. The sun had baked the plowed land into a gray mass. Once the house had been painted, but now it was as dull and gray as everything else. When Aunt Em came there to live, she was a young, pretty wife, but the sun and wind had changed her too. They had taken the sparkle from her cheeks and eyes and left them gray. She never smiled. When Dorothy, who was an orphan, first came to her, Aunt Em had been startled by the child's laughter. Whenever Dorothy's merry voice reached her ears, she looked at the little girl with wonder that she could find anything to laugh at. Uncle Henry never laughed. He worked hard from morning till night. He was gray also, from his long beard to his rough boots. It was Toto that made Dorothy laugh. Toto was a little black dog with long silky hair and twinkling black eyes. Toto played all day long, and Dorothy played with him and loved him dearly. Today, however, they were not playing. Uncle Henry sat upon the doorstep and looked anxiously at the sky. Dorothy stood in the door with Toto in her arms and looked at the sky too. From the far north they heard a low wail of the wind, and Uncle Henry and Dorothy could see where the long grass bowed in waves before the coming storm. There now came a sharp whistling in the air from the south, and as they turned their eyes that way, they saw ripples in the grass coming from that direction also. Suddenly Uncle Henry stood up. "There's a cyclone coming, Em," he called. "I'll go look after the stock." Then he ran toward where the cows and horses were kept. Aunt Em dropped her work and came to the door. One glance told her of the danger at hand. "Quick, Dorothy!" she screamed. "Run for the cellar." Toto jumped out of Dorothy's arms and hid under the bed. Aunt Em threw open the trap door and climbed down the ladder into the dark cellar. Dorothy caught Toto at last and started to follow her aunt. All at once there came a great shriek from the wind, and the house shook so hard that she lost her footing and sat down suddenly on the floor. A strange thing happened. The house whirled around 2 or 3 times and slowly rose through the air. Dorothy felt as if she were going up in a balloon. The great pressure of the wind on every side of the house raised it up higher and higher till it was at the very top of the cyclone, and there it remained and was carried miles and miles away, as easily as you could carry a feather. It was very dark, and the wind howled horribly around her. But Dorothy found she was riding quite easily. After the first few whirls around, she felt as if she were being rocked gently. Hour after hour passed, and Dorothy got over her fright, but she felt quite lonely, and the wind shrieked loudly all about her. At first she wondered if she'd be dashed to pieces when the house fell, but as time passed and nothing terrible happened, she stopped worrying. At last she crawled over the swaying floor to her bed and lay down. Toto followed and lay down beside her. In spite of the swaying of the house and the wailing of the wind, Dorothy soon closed her eyes and fell fast asleep. Dorothy was awakened by a shock. What had happened? Toto put his little nose into her face and whined. She sprang from her bed and, with Toto at her heels, ran and opened the door. Dorothy gave a cry of amazement and looked about her, her eyes growing bigger and bigger at the wonderful sight she saw. The cyclone had set the house down very gently for a cyclone, in the midst of a country of marvelous beauty. Banks of gorgeous flowers were on every hand, and birds with brilliant plumage sang in the trees and bushes. While she stood gazing at the strange sights, she saw coming toward her a group of very queer people. They were not as big as the grown folks she knew, nor were they very small. In fact, they seemed about Dorothy's size, although they looked much older. The three men and one woman were all oddly dressed. They wore round hats that rose to a point with little bells around the brims that tinkled sweetly as they moved. The men's hats were blue. The little woman's hat was white, and she wore a white gown sprinkled with little stars that glistened in the sun. The men were about as old as Uncle Henry, but the little woman was much older. Her hair was nearly white, and she walked rather stiffly. They drew near the house, and the little old woman walked up to Dorothy, made a low bow, and said, "You are welcome, most noble sorceress, to the land of the Munchkins. We are so grateful for you for having killed the Wicked Witch of the East and setting our people free from bondage." What could she possibly mean by calling Dorothy a sorceress? And she had never killed anything. "You are very kind, but there must be some mistake. I have not killed anything," said Dorothy. "Your house did, anyway," said the old woman with a laugh, "and that is much the same thing. See?" Dorothy looked and gave a cry of fright. There, under the corner of the house, 2 feet were sticking out, with silver shoes. "That's all that's left of the Wicked Witch of the East. She enslaved all of the Munchkins for many years. Now they are free, and very grateful for you for the favor." "Who are the Munchkins?" asked Dorothy of the old woman. "They are the people who live in this land of the East." "Are you a Munchkin?" asked Dorothy. "No, I am the Witch of the North, but I'm a good witch." Then she laughed. The dead witch's feet had disappeared. Good photo of that. So we'll stop there for today, and I cannot wait to read more to you tomorrow.